firstly, thank you all for coming. I'm David Oliver from PA Consulting, and it's really pleasing to see such a big audience on a Thursday afternoon, particularly on the second day of the conference. So I thought I'd start off with a bit of a joke, and I've tried various versions with my marketing and my comms team, and they've told me that most of them are not any good. So I'm going for a slightly safer.
The People program is continuing in the Jacobs Theatre right now. And if you're one of the apprentices, go down to the next generation zone, please.
Comedy is all about timing, isn't it?
If you want to go to Highways People and don't have a ticket, don't worry, you can get in.
I think that's code for it's not that popular. So as I've got a crowd, I'll tell my gag. So an autonomous car crashes next to a bar. What happens? Nobody knows. And that's exactly why 2021 is a really optimistic point of view. So I have an animation.
Much hype exists around driverless cars. Daily reports of new car launches keep us in anticipation. When will we be able to try this innovative new mode of transport? Autonomous technology is not part of some imagined future scene. It's happening today. But what needs to happen beyond technology to make this possible? Our research shows that autonomous vehicles are at least 10 years away and require each player in a complex roads network to work together. So who needs to be involved? Highways authorities need to upgrade our roads. We need to develop the right communications and systems. Law enforcement need to make sure we're safe. Governments need new laws for the roads and the data. Insurers need to know who is liable. Automotive manufacturers must share their vision. And regulators need to work together with industry. Autonomous vehicles are the future, but we need to address the roadblocks in their way. PA, we make the difference.
So that's lovely, because it gives my voice a rest. And it also sums up most of what I'm going to say next. So what we've got here is a rich picture. And it's done by Edward Morley, who's one of our guys. Some of you from the highway side might know. And although you can't read all the detail up there, I think there's two things to take away from it. One, it's a massively complicated system with loads and loads of different players who've all got to come together to make this system work for autonomous vehicles to be a success. And I think that's why, government ministers with a very hard lever that they pull and say 2021 is massively optimistic. I think that interconnectedness and that detail is really the key thing. I think what we're going to do in the presentation as we go through is we're going to move through each of those areas and play back some of the findings of our research. So the research was conducted with an expert panel that spanned regulation, telecoms, communications, vehicle manufacturers. It was reinforced with the survey data, and then we had a couple of roundtable discussions to kick the findings round. So we've gone through quite a robust process to come out with these data. And really, that's why we're quite confident that next year or the year after isn't the answer, but probably something more like 10 years is. So it's Highways UK, so I'll start with highways authorities. There's a massive challenge around what the infrastructure should be. There's a massive challenge around how the communications infrastructure should go in. So 5G, no one really knows when it's going to go in. No one knows when we're going to have low latency 5G. People are exploring whether Wi-Fi networks might be part of the answer. We've been debating with colleagues around, should Highways England be a controlling mind? Who's going to actually provide the grip? Who's going to communicate when there's an emergency to autonomous vehicles who might have drivers who are asleep? So there's some massive challenges there for Highways England and the local authorities to grapple with. And I think the second thing is the last mile. So the last mile is massively important at the moment in terms of, last mile, first mile, is massively important in terms of customer satisfaction, customer journey. And that's going to become equally challenging in terms of autonomous vehicles, because actually customers and users, if we're going to get people driving these vehicles, will want to be able to be in autonomous mode the whole time. They won't want to have to switch in, switch out as they come on the SRN, off the SRN, or just onto the MRN, or onto local authority roads. So I think that brings us to our recommendations. I think there's a need for something long-term, and there's a need for something that spans across the SRN, the MRN, and local authorities. So there's a proper coherence of the structure, the infrastructure, and the operations of CAVs on the network. I think the second thing is we should focus our efforts. So it's not something that having every local authority do a separate trial, having lots of little sporadic things going on is the way forward. And I know that's already underway, and Tim's going to be speaking to you after me about some of the big trials that are already underway. But actually having those big flagship focused efforts to move things on and to understand why CAVs are really important and how they're going to interact in the real world. So, government. Government have it really tough here because there is no easy answer for a lot of the challenges they're facing. So, trying to get public engagement and acceptance is going to be really hard. So, how hard was rammed home to me. I was doing a talk on, for the UN on sustainable development goals recently, and we were looking at disruptive technologies and how they might make a difference to the delivery of the sustainable development goals. So we had a room full of tech heads from across big multinationals, and we were talking to them about autonomous vehicles and how they could transform agriculture, they could connect people, they could connect schools, change the dynamic of the balance of female work in some of the developing world. And they just didn't get why they should be using them. And that's, I think, one of the real challenges for us as a sector. They didn't get the case, and they didn't understand why them. So actually getting someone to say, do you know what, that makes my school run easier. I'd put my child in that car. And they were nowhere near that, and they were really enthused with tech. So I think that gives us a scale of the challenge that we're facing in terms of public acceptance. And policy. So policy's really hard. I used to be a policy person. I used to work in central government. It's sort of easy to knock, but hard to get right, I think, is where I'd see it. And the policy on this is really difficult because it's the kind of stuff that's not been going on in the road sector before. Cars have been reasonably stable for a long time. And what we've got now is something that could transform that. But before it transforms it, we've got something that's going to make it really messy and really difficult. So as you move into operating a mixed network of CAV, of non-autonomous, of people, of cyclists, I think the guy on the panel before was mentioning horse riders, hopefully not on the SRN, but you're going to get this really difficult, challenging mix of people, cars, and pedestrians all interplaying. How you get that right, how you do it in a way that encourages uptake, how you deliver on the government's ambition to be a leader in autonomous vehicles is really difficult. So for each of these, we've got our recommendation. I think there's something that needs to be done around the value of driverless cars to society. So I don't think we've got it nailed in terms of a case. I think it sits there in the back of our minds, but I haven't seen anything that really kills the argument dead that these are something that are going to be good for society and going to drive that benefit for wider society. So I think, we all know that highways, they might give us great capacity benefits. That's not the same thing. And that's not going to win anyone's hearts and minds, I think. I think then, having made that case, we've got to go out and sell it. And I think that's where we need the levers of government. We need really hard, big press machines to roll behind this and push it. And I think everyone in the industry can play their part, but actually, that's where we do need the government ministers setting really strong ambition and really clear direction. And then I think we need to be ready to overcome the challenges. So people are going to raise the difficult, awkward questions. How are you going to get this coexistence? Are you going to section off lanes? That's reasonable. Are you going to want to lose the fast lane to autonomous vehicles? How's that going to go down with an electorate with an 8-year life cycle on cars? It's going to be really hard to make that happen and make that work. Atkins did a piece of research recently for DFT. You could see cautious autonomy kicking in. So actually, you could see congestion getting worse as these cars get introduced to the network because the cars will take account of the fact that people are unpredictable. So it's going to be a really messy, hard transition that's going to happen, and we need to prepare for it, and we need to prepare the public for it, and that plays back to that public acceptance again. So it's not going to be rosy, and we're not going to get to nirvana fast. So linked to policy, we have regulation. And regulation, again, is a real potential roadblock for this work. I'll play on my title there. The traffic regulations just won't work with the way they're configured at the moment. You've got the security challenges of the autonomous vehicles. So getting both the cyber right, getting the physical security right, how you do that in a regulated environment is really, really difficult. And how you do it without a policy framework that's functioning or without cars on the road to examine their operation makes things harder still. So we've got these out at 11 years. And I think this isn't a criticism of where the people driving the work is sort of at. This is sort of more a reality check from a serious expert panel about how hard we think it's going to be to get these vehicles up and running on the road. So, technology. So my personal view for a second, rather than the expert panels, I think 13 years is a bit pessimistic, to be honest. I think if Volvo are saying by 2021 they're going to have an autonomous vehicle, I'd probably trust Volvo. But I guess where I have a much more sympathy is around the technology. So actually getting it all integrated, ready, and getting it built into a system is going to be massively challenging, and I think 13 years for that sounds much more likely. I've had a friend from one of the major OEMs who was talking to me about this, and there's some quite interesting views about who's going to take on the actual, who's going to be the manufacturers of the cars of the future. Is it going to be Apple? Is it going to be your Googles? Or is it actually going to be your traditional OEMs? And what's the sort of ecosystem that you're going to end up with? He was relatively confident, actually. He thinks building cars is very hard. He was an engineer. He worked on a production line. I have some sympathy with him. He said, you know, building phones is great. You've built a load of core capabilities to build an awesome phone. They're very pretty and they do great things. It's not a couple of tons of metal driving on a road. And we're awesome at that. And that level of confidence, I think, sets out some of the challenges that we're going to face, actually, in terms of who's going to be defining that going forward and who's going to be owning that space. And I think that's one of the challenges for the UK, too. So there's a massive challenge about who's going to own the sort of manufacture and the technology, which links to the acceptance. So if we're the people who are building and developing these cars, and if we're the country that's driving forward the development of these cars, actually acceptance is going to be much better. You know, it's going to be much better if actually it's a car that's been developed with a supply chain in the UK, built in the UK. That's a much stronger and more positive message for the government to sell and to push. And I know that's where they're looking at. So, which takes us to our recommendations. I think the first thing is a skills strategy. So, taking some lessons from Network Rail when they digitized and electrified the railways, there's a real need to make sure the skills are there and ready. And it's not waiting until the cars are predominant on the network, it's doing it right now, getting those people ready, getting them trained, you know, like the apprenticeship scheme does in Highways England, making great progress with a range of different disciplines. Getting the national standards ready. I mean, this is a massive bugbear, the VHS versus Betamax argument. It goes round and round, but actually, whether it's driven by a supranational body in the UN, or whether it's driven by the government, or whether it's driven by the manufacturers, it needs resolving, and it needs resolving quickly. And then business models. So we've got mobility as a service. It may become more concrete than Copenhagen and, you know, a couple of other small Danish places. You may get these big tech integrators taking a role in it. We need to work out how those business models are going to work in detail and how they're going to work for all of the different players. Because actually, you know, relating to Google is a very tricky thing for government to do because Google's big enough to be difficult with government now. So actually defining your business model and your operating model early, getting it nailed first, is a really key thing for everyone, both for operators, for funders, and for constructors. So, insurers. I think this is the only time that I say car insurers are doing a massively positive job and they're ahead of everyone else in the world. I think actually the insurance models have moved quite quickly. I think CCAV have done a really good job moving the insurance models on, and that's why we've got them at 8 years. Going back to my car crashing outside a bar, though, there's a lot of work to be done to establish liability. So you as a consumer might get paid, but who's going to pay the insurer? Where's the court case going to get settled? And I think that's going to be really difficult, because we're going to move from an environment where you investigate a crash, you've got 2, 3 vehicles involved, hopefully no one's seriously injured, to something where you've got 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different vehicles who've all been in the vicinity of, have all been sucking in data, and suddenly you've got this massive wave of electronic data to look at, and someone's got to start analysing it. It's not going to be the police, because they don't have the capacity. Insurers have got a direct interest, but that's getting under the skin of where do you draw the line, what's reasonable, is going to be really hard. Looking at actually the modifications and where the responsibility sits is also going to be really tricky. So we know that people take the limiters out of their motorbike fuel injection. We know that people take the filters out of their diesel cars. I think it's reasonably safe to assume people are going to mess with the software in their autonomous vehicles to give themselves something a bit souped up. That crashes. That's not the manufacturer's software anymore. That's not the car that was insured. So who's going to pay? And I think, do you alter your premium depending on what mode you're in? So you're in eco mode, you're in sports mode. You've had a crash in sports mode, that must be more your fault. You drive more in sports mode, you're going to pay more money, even though you're not driving? Or should the sports mode be safe? Should the insurers suck it up? So these are some really difficult challenges that we're going to get to. And I think they're on it, everyone's looking at it, but it's taking that systems approach where you say, okay, the policy is going to define this environment, the regulators are going to make it work, and because of the way it's regulated and the policies, that framework that's been set, it's going to work for the insurers because they know what the manufacturers are going to do, driving updates. So, law enforcement. Again, 10 years-ish. It's going to be really tricky to enforce this, and I think the crime's going to get more complicated and more difficult. We know from the cyber and we know from online fraud, criminals adapt faster than we do. Criminals will find a use for vehicles that they can drive while not being there. It's not rocket science to see contraband drugs, guns being delivered. Can you control the CAV without being in the CAV? Can you get it there remotely? I bet you can modify them. So we've seen a lot of, unfortunately, terror attacks with vehicles being used as weapons. Again, how do you get into that? What's the protocol for law enforcement stopping vehicles? How do they get into the data? What's the privacy? What's the right privacy balance for law enforcement to say, do you know what? I don't want the data, or I do. And how far can they go into where you've been and what you've been up to investigate a crime? And is it enough that your vehicle was near a crime to get all the data of where you've traveled for a crime? So you quite quickly get into some quite tricky policy issues in a similar way to intercept. So that's a canter, I think, through the challenges that we're facing across a number of the domains that we're looking at. I think because we're management consultants, we like to try and simplify complexity, having laid out a large amount of complexity. And I think this is the start of how we do it. And it's a capability framework, which is our techie word. I think what it really is a bunch of stuff that we need to get much better at fast. So sitting beneath this, each of these areas has a set of sub-capabilities that give a bit more detail and put some flesh onto the bones. There's about 6 or 7 for each, but that slide looked really, really busy and completely unreadable, so I haven't got it up here. But if you want to come and see it, we're around the corner. We have a report. It's good. Plug done. I think the lesson with this, though, and it's the same one with the rich picture that we had at the start, it's a very complicated system that you can't treat in isolation, And that makes it much more challenging because actually the policymakers, the regulators can't find a nice, neat, tidy problem and deal with it. They've got to reach out across everyone. The insurers can't design a financial model that works until they've got the policy and the regulation right. So again, there's people breaking down the traditional sort of silos and ways of working and boundaries. So it's hard, there's a lot to do, but actually it's a really, really exciting time.